Few records remain from the earliest years of the Goins family's life on the ridge. But those that do have been handled for generations with a peculiar reverence, as if the paper itself carried some residue of the tragedy that would later unfold there. The first entries appear in the county land ledger of 1879, listing one Isaac Goins, farmer, as purchaser of 40 acres of rocky highland near the Kentucky border. A place considered too remote and inhospitable for most settlers, the deed described, a cabin and outbuilding in fair repair, though even that modest appraisal overstated the truth. The land was steep, the soil thin, and the nearest road lay nearly 2 miles away through dense forest. It was, as later observers would note, an ideal refuge for a man who wished to live apart from the world. Isaac had arrived with his wife Eliza and their 4 children, 3 boys and a daughter who, by all accounts, did not survive long after the family's move. The cause of her death was never recorded. A local physician claimed to have been summoned too late to help, and when asked years later, he recalled only that the woman refused any Christian burial, saying the child belonged to the Lord alone. It was the first of many remarks that would later seem prophetic. Neighbors were few, and those who lived within a day's ride came to know the Goins family only by reputation. Isaac was described as quiet, sometimes sullen, but hard-working. He seldom spoke at gatherings, never attended church, and was known to discourage visitors from approaching his property. Eliza was seen even less often. Some said she had a stern, watchful look that made others uneasy. Others claimed she was ill or not right in her mind. By the time the 1880 census was taken, her name was marked only with a single notation beside it: Keeps House. The Goins boys, Caleb, Josiah, and Benjamin, grew up in near complete isolation. They did not attend the small schoolhouse in the valley, and there are no records of their baptism or confirmation. When Isaac came down to trade at the general store twice a year, he bought salt, kerosene, and occasionally a sack of flour, nothing that suggested a family interested in comfort. The storekeeper later recalled that Isaac spoke of the ridge as holy ground, a place set apart. When pressed on what he meant, the man simply said, "The world's wickedness won't climb this high." Isaac Goins died in the spring of 1897. The county coroner recorded the cause of death as a crushing injury from a fallen tree, though no one from town had witnessed the burial. A neighbor named Hollis Turner, who lived 3 miles away, told authorities that he had been asked to say some words over the grave, but found the family already finished when he arrived. The woman, Turner said, was standing there with her sons behind her like soldiers. She told me their father was already in paradise and didn't need any of our prayers. After Isaac's death, the family withdrew even further from the world. The boys, then in their teens and early 20s, were rarely seen beyond the ridge. Their cabin chimney could sometimes be glimpsed from the valley below, a faint line of smoke rising through the trees, proof that they still lived. But travelers who passed along the old mountain road told uneasy stories. Strange chanting heard in the woods, lanterns burning through the night, and once, the echo of a woman's voice calling names in the dark. Such tales were easily dismissed as frontier superstition until the first disappearance. In 1898, a surveyor named Martin Hayes was sent by the county to mark property boundaries along the ridge. He left Wise on a Wednesday morning and was last seen riding west toward the Goins homestead. When he failed to return by the weekend, a brief search was made. His horse was found grazing near the base of the trail, saddle still strapped tight but the rider gone. The searchers ventured halfway up the mountain, but turned back before reaching the cabin. Heavy rain had made the path impassable, and one of the men swore he heard gunfire echoing from the trees. The matter was quietly dropped, the official record concluding that Hayes had likely become lost or fallen victim to the elements. Over the next decade, 4 more men vanished in similar circumstances: a traveling merchant, a tinker, a miner on his way home from Kentucky, and a preacher rumored to have been visiting the ridge to call the family back to grace. Each case was investigated briefly, then filed away without resolution. The Goins name became synonymous with misfortune, and mothers told their children never to stray too far from the valley path. "The ridge takes what it wants," they said, "and it don't give back." Yet for all the rumors, the law hesitated to act. The Goins cabin lay beyond clear jurisdictional boundaries, and no one wanted to risk angering a family that had long cultivated its isolation. Sheriff Thomas Compton, then a young deputy, would later recall that even the suggestion of searching the property brought more silence than agreement. The people of Wise County preferred their ghosts undisturbed. When Eliza next appeared in town, 4 years after her husband's death, she caused a quiet stir. Dressed head to toe in black, her gray hair drawn tight behind her head, she walked through the general store, as if on an errand of divine purpose. She bought salt, nails, and a roll of heavy canvas, paid in exact coin, and left without a word. The storekeeper swore that her eyes never blinked once. She looked like she'd been carved out of the mountain itself. He later said, cold and patient. In those same years, the county began to hear whispers about the sons. Tall, broad-shouldered men who rarely spoke and never left their mother's side. One, it was said, had been seen repairing the fence near the road, and another cutting wood with a strength that bordered on unnatural. But the most persistent rumor, passed from farm to farm in hushed tones, concerned what happened after sunset. A wagon driver once claimed to have glimpsed candlelight flickering through the cabin window at midnight, 3 shadows kneeling before a 4th that stood above them, arms raised like a preacher at the pulpit. "They were praying," he said, "but not to any god I knew." By the turn of the century, the Goins family had become less a part of the community than a legend within it. Old folks swore that strange lights could be seen over the ridge during storms, and hunters spoke of finding crude symbols carved into trees near the property line. Circles intersected by crosses, marked always with a single letter, E. When a deputy once ventured close enough to the trail to catch sight of the cabin, he turned back almost immediately. "It felt wrong," he told Compton. "Like walking into a church where something's been buried under the floor." Despite the unease, life in the valley went on. The railroad came through Wise County, the coal companies arrived, and the rest of Virginia moved into the new century. But the Goins Ridge remained untouched by progress, a relic of an older, harsher world that refused to yield. When Compton finally took office as sheriff in 1908, he made quiet note of the unsolved disappearances and the family's name, though he admitted privately that he had little hope of ever proving anything. "The mountain keeps its secrets," he wrote in his logbook, "and those who go looking for them often join them." In the spring of 1912, a change came from the most unlikely source, a young mail carrier named Thomas Brennan. Brennan, new to his route, was by all accounts earnest, respectful, and deeply superstitious. He avoided the ridge whenever possible, leaving mail for the Goins family in a box at the end of the trail, rather than risk approaching the cabin itself. But one afternoon, while passing the property, he saw movement by the fence, a man mending rails in the sun. Brennan called out a greeting. The man looked up. It was Benjamin, the youngest son, though Brennan did not know his name. What caught his attention was not the man's face, but the hat he wore, a brown bowler, unusually fine, with a curved brim and a dark ribbon band. Brennan recognized it instantly. 2 months earlier, he had seen that same hat on the head of a traveling ice salesman named Edmund Pierce, who had passed him on the road bound for Wise, and who had since vanished without a trace. Brennan's report, made hesitantly to Sheriff Compton the following week, would break a silence that had lasted for more than 30 years. It was a small detail, perhaps too small for most men to risk speaking aloud, but it was enough to stir something long dormant in the sheriff's mind. He retrieved the old case files, Hayes, the tinker, the preacher, the salesman, and saw, for the first time, a pattern carved like a scar across the county's history. The time had come, he decided, to climb the ridge, to be continued in part eve, the search and the discovery. When Sheriff Thomas Compton assembled his men in the gray hours before dawn on June 15, 1912, the air itself seemed charged with foreboding. A light fog hung over the valley, softening the outlines of trees and fence posts into pale ghosts against the pale blue of the coming morning. Compton chose his deputies carefully, men he trusted not only to keep silent, but to stand firm should the ridge live up to its reputation. Each was given a revolver, a rifle, and strict orders: no talk, no hesitation, no retreat. The ride up the ridge route was slow and silent. The horses, perhaps sensing their riders' unease, snorted and balked at shadows that seemed to move where none should have been. The trail narrowed to little more than a deer path, winding between great boulders and stands of hickory. Twice they dismounted to lead the animals over washouts where spring rains had carved deep ruts in the clay. By the time the first rim of sunlight touched the treetops, the Goins homestead came into view. A cabin of rough, hewn logs crouched beneath a grove of oak, its chimney breathing a thin line of smoke into the morning air. The three brothers were already outside, as if they had known the lawmen were coming. They stood in a row before the cabin door, each man broad-shouldered, sun-darkened, and expressionless. Their mother sat on a wooden bench to one side, her black dress immaculate, despite the dust, her hands folded in her lap like a figure carved from stone. When Compton and his deputies halted at the clearing's edge, not a word was spoken. Even the birds had fallen silent. "Mrs. Goins," Compton said at last, raising his voice to carry across the space between them. "I have cause to search this property in connection with a missing person. I'd prefer your cooperation, but I'll proceed with or without it." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Eliza Goins lifted her eyes. They were pale, almost colorless, and when they met the sheriff's, he felt something cold stir in his chest. A sense not of defiance but of pity, as though she saw him as a child about to touch fire. She turned to her sons and spoke a few words too low for Compton to hear. The men stepped aside. 2 deputies were left to guard the family, while the others began the search. The cabin itself proved neat, even austere. Every item seemed placed according to an order only its occupants could understand. The floors scrubbed bare, the walls hung with a few faded scriptures, and a Bible resting on a table worn smooth by decades of use. There was no sign of wealth, no indication of trade or visitors, and yet something about the space felt wrong, as if it had been preserved for a purpose that lay beyond human reason. Compton moved methodically through each room, taking notes. He found little of interest until Deputy James Harland called from behind the smokehouse. The sheriff stepped outside, shielding his eyes against the sun. Harland stood over a patch of earth darker than the soil around it, the surface uneven as though recently disturbed. Spring rains had cut small rivulets through the soft ground, exposing what looked like a fragment of cloth. Compton knelt and brushed away the dirt. The fabric was coarse linen, and beneath it, something pale and rigid. Within an hour, the deputies had uncovered the remains of a man buried in a shallow grave less than 3 feet deep. The body was badly decomposed, but enough remained to tell a grim story. A fractured skull, splintered ribs, and, in the jacket pocket, a damp business card bearing the name Edmund Pierce, salesman. The sheriff removed his hat. For 14 years, he had chased whispers and rumors across the county, finding nothing but silence. Now the truth had broken the surface, like something rising from a long sleep. He turned toward the cabin, where Eliza sat watching, her face unreadable. "Mrs. Goins," he called, "we'll be continuing our search." Inside, the deputies pried open a locked chest, found beneath a loose floorboard in Eliza's room. The contents were a small museum of missing lives, a silver watch engraved with initials matching those of Martin Hayes, the lost surveyor, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles in a Richmond optometrist's case, 4 empty wallets, their linings brittle with age, and a woman's locket containing a photograph of an infant no one could identify. Each item told a fragment of a story long buried, each whispering of a life that had ended somewhere on this mountain. But it was Deputy Samuel Croft who made the discovery that would haunt every man present for the rest of his days. While inspecting the smokehouse, a rough building used, in better times, to cure meat, he noticed that several of the floorboards gave off a hollow sound when stepped upon. Kneeling, he pried one up with the tip of his knife. The stench that rose was faint but unmistakable, the dry, sweet odor of decay. Beneath the boards lay a shallow cavity lined with stones. Wrapped in rotting cloth were two small bundles, no larger than the loaves of bread cooling on a farmhouse window. When unwrapped, they revealed the skeletal remains of infants, bones delicate as twigs, skulls no bigger than a man's fist. Even the most hardened deputy turned away. Croft crossed himself without a word. Compton stood a long time in silence before replacing his hat. He walked out into the yard, the morning sun now high enough to cast sharp shadows across the clearing. Eliza sat exactly as before, her sons in irons beside her. The sheriff approached slowly, his boots grinding against the dry earth. "Mrs. Goins," he said quietly, "we found what was under your smokehouse. I need you to tell me what those children were doing there." For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her expression did not change. Her voice, when it came, was calm and measured. "They were blessed," she said. "They were the purest souls ever born. What we did was done for the Lord's design." The Compton later told the court that her words froze his blood more than the sight itself. There was no madness in her tone, no trace of hysteria, only the quiet certainty of faith. She spoke of destiny, of purity, of a sacred lineage that must remain untouched by the world. Her sons, she said, had followed her will, as Abraham followed the voice of God. The sheriff, though a man of belief himself, found he could not meet her gaze for long. The family was taken into custody that same afternoon. Word spread quickly through the county. By nightfall, half the town of Wise had gathered outside the jailhouse, whispering prayers or curses, depending on which they believed more appropriate. Compton ordered the prisoners kept separate and instructed his deputies to say nothing of what had been found until a formal report could be filed. But the Ridge, silent for decades, had at last given up its secrets, and there was no containing them now. In the days that followed, Eliza spoke freely with the sheriff. She did not weep or plead for mercy. Instead, she delivered long, rambling monologues about Scripture, her interpretations of Genesis, her belief that the laws of men had perverted the will of God. She spoke of blood made pure, of chosen vessels, of a family set apart to preserve holiness. Her sons, raised under her rule since childhood, had come to accept her every word as divine command. What others might have called sin, she named obedience. Compton listened because it was his duty, though each interview left him shaken. In his notes he wrote, "The woman believes herself an instrument of providence. Her mind is gone, but her conviction is absolute. She has replaced the Almighty with her own reflection." Caleb and Josiah refused to speak at all. When asked about the travelers, they stared blankly ahead, neither denying nor confirming. Only the youngest, Benjamin, already pale from illness, seemed troubled by doubt. "Ma said it was for heaven," he whispered once. And we believed her. He would die of tuberculosis before the trial began, his faith in his mother unbroken even as his body failed. By August, the case had drawn national attention. Reporters arrived from Richmond and Washington, their dispatches describing a mountain cult of unholy doctrine. The courthouse overflowed daily with townsfolk who had once avoided even speaking the family's name. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others came to witness justice for the lost. The prosecutor presented the evidence, the grave, the artifacts, the confession, with a restraint that only deepened its horror. The defense offered no witnesses. Eliza sat through it all in silence, hands folded in her lap, lips moving in what appeared to be prayer. Only once did she speak, when asked whether she regretted what had been done. "There is nothing to regret," she said softly. "The world will come to understand." The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. The trial of Eliza Goins and her sons began on August 5, 1912, under a summer sun so merciless that spectators shaded their faces with newspapers as they crowded outside the Wise County Courthouse. Word of the case had traveled far beyond the Blue Ridge, from Richmond to Atlanta, even as far north as Chicago. Reporters arrived by train, their dispatches describing the proceedings as the most ghastly and bewildering trial ever held in the Commonwealth. For the people of Wise County, it was more than a spectacle. It was the unraveling of something they had long refused to acknowledge. That within the quiet valleys and dark hollows they called home, unimaginable horrors could take root and flourish behind closed doors. The courtroom and the accused inside the courthouse. The air was stifling. The smell of ink, sweat, and wood oil hung heavy in the packed room. On the front bench sat Sheriff Thomas Compton, his lined face betraying exhaustion rather than triumph. Months of investigation had taken their toll. He had seen justice done, but there was little satisfaction in it. Eliza Goins sat at the defendant's table in a plain black dress. Her hair was pulled tightly back, revealing a face that seemed carved from marble. Calm, unreadable, and eerily serene. On either side of her sat Caleb and Josiah, their wrists shackled loosely to the table, their expressions vacant. They did not look at one another, nor at the crowd that pressed close to catch every word. The proceedings opened with the reading of 7 counts of murder, among other charges related to concealment of evidence and unlawful burial. The names of the dead: Edmund Pierce, Martin Hayes, Jacob Trent, Samuel Dorsey, and others lost to the ridge, echoed through the chamber, each name followed by a murmur of recognition or horror from the spectators. Eliza listened in silence, eyes lowered, hands clasped in prayer. Caleb sat motionless, his massive shoulders bowed. Josiah's lips moved faintly, as though repeating a verse only he could hear. The prosecution's case. The Commonwealth's attorney, Benjamin Carter, was a man known for both his precision and restraint. He spoke not of damnation or monstrosity, but of fact and evidence. He laid before the court the artifacts recovered from the Goins homestead: the engraved watch, the spectacles, the locket, and the worn leather wallets bearing faint impressions of the victims' names. Each was presented without embellishment. The simplicity of it was devastating. When the photographs of the excavation were displayed, the shallow grave, the smokehouse floorboards lifted to reveal the small, cloth-wrapped forms, an audible sob rose from the gallery. Judge Andrew McDowell, a man not easily shaken, called for order twice before calm was restored. Carter's argument was methodical, that Eliza Goins had exercised absolute control over her sons, fostering a delusion that placed their family above all moral law. That together they had conspired to murder travelers who ventured too near their secluded property, and that their acts were not madness alone, but the product of willful intent masked in the language of faith. The sheriff was called to testify. His voice was steady as he recounted his first visit to the ridge years earlier, the wall of silence he had encountered, and the grim discoveries made that June morning. When asked about Eliza's demeanor upon arrest, he paused before answering. She wasn't afraid, he said quietly. She believed she'd done the Lord's work. The courtroom fell silent. The confession, but the most damning evidence came from Eliza herself. Her own written confession, taken over several interviews in the county jail. It was read aloud in its entirety, a document both theological and delusional, filled with references to Genesis, to divine selection, to the purity of chosen blood. Her words described not murder but sacrifice, not incest but sanctification. She wrote, "Man's law is a shadow, God's law is the flame. And I have walked in the flame, so that my sons might be made holy." Each sentence struck the courtroom like a blow. The audience shifted uncomfortably. A woman fainted near the back. When the reading ended, there was a long silence, broken only by the creak of wooden benches. The defense, led by an appointed attorney from Abingdon, offered no attempt at denial. His only argument was that Eliza Goins was insane, her mind destroyed by years of isolation and grief following her husband's death. He claimed her sons were victims as much as perpetrators, raised in darkness, knowing no other world but the one their mother had built from scripture and fear. The verdict: the jury retired shortly before noon on the trial's 5th day. 3 hours later, they returned. No one doubted the outcome. Caleb and Josiah Goins were found guilty of 7 counts of murder and sentenced to hang. Eliza Goins was found guilty but insane, to be committed for life to the Southwestern State Hospital in Marion, Virginia. As the verdict was read, Eliza showed no reaction. She sat perfectly still, her lips moving in silent prayer. Caleb lowered his head, Josiah stared straight ahead, tears running silently down his face. Sheriff Compton, standing near the rear of the courtroom, removed his hat once more. He had chased this mystery for 14 years, and now that it was over, he felt only an aching emptiness. The hangings on November said, 1912, Caleb Goins was led to the gallows in the courthouse yard. The sky was iron gray. A cold wind carried the first flakes of snow. He refused the preacher's offer of prayer, saying only, "Ma said heaven waits." The drop was clean. 3 weeks later, his brother Josiah followed. Neither man spoke in his final moments. The executions were attended by more than 100 townspeople, though many turned away as the trap fell. Few spoke afterward. There was no triumph, only relief, and shame that such horrors had been allowed to grow so long unnoticed. Eliza's final years, Eliza Goins was transported under guard to the asylum in Marion, where she lived for another 8 years. The attendants recorded her as lucid, articulate, and wholly unrepentant. She spent her days reading scripture and writing long, rambling letters addressed to the generations yet unborn, which she insisted would vindicate her. She refused all visitors except for the occasional minister, whom she often lectured rather than listened to. One doctor's report from 1919 noted, "She remains utterly convinced that her mission was divine and that the world is blind to its own corruption." No remorse is evident, only conviction. Eliza Goins died quietly in her sleep in the spring of 1920, her Bible open on her chest. She was buried in an unmarked grave on hospital grounds, her name recorded only in the institution's ledger. None of her kin claimed the body. The burning of the cabin, the Goins homestead, left abandoned after the arrests, stood for more than a decade as a silent monument to what had happened there. Locals avoided the ridge entirely. Hunters refused to set traps within sight of the clearing. Travelers took long detours to avoid the old trail. Some claimed to hear voices in the pines at dusk, faint cries, or the echo of a woman's hymn carried on the wind. Then, in 1924, the cabin burned. No one claimed responsibility, and no official investigation was made. The fire consumed the house, the smokehouse, and the barn, leaving only blackened stone and ash. When dawn broke, nothing remained but the chimney, and a single iron hinge glinting in the ashes. Most believed the fire had been set deliberately, not out of malice, but as a form of cleansing. The land needed to forget. An old farmer told a reporter years later, that ridge was sick with memory, legacy and reflection. The case of the Goins family left an enduring mark on Virginia's history. Though largely forgotten outside the region, it prompted real reform within the state's law enforcement system. The governor's office, shocked by the failures that allowed so many disappearances to go uninvestigated, ordered the creation of statewide missing persons protocols. County sheriffs were required to share records, and rural investigations were no longer dismissed as lost in the wilderness. But beyond the legal changes, the story became a parable whispered through generations, a reminder of what isolation, silence, and unchecked belief could breed. Folklore took hold where fact left off. Travelers spoke of the Ridge of Lost Souls, a haunted stretch of wilderness where strange lights were seen at night, and where compasses failed to point north. Children were warned not to wander too far from home, lest the Goins spirit find them in the dark. For Sheriff Compton, the case was both his greatest achievement and his deepest sorrow. He retired 3 years later, his health failing. In his final interview with a local reporter, he said only, "The evil wasn't just in that cabin. It was in the silence around it, in the people who saw something wrong and looked away." He died in 1918, 2 years before Eliza, and was buried not far from the courthouse where the trial had been held. On his gravestone, a simple inscription reads, "He sought the truth." Epilogue: today, the ridge has reclaimed the land. Trees rise where the cabin once stood. Moss covers the stones of the old chimney. Hikers who venture near find nothing but forest, and yet the air there carries a peculiar stillness, as though memory itself lingers beneath the soil. The Goins case, stripped of its sensational headlines, remains a story of human frailty, of faith twisted into madness, of sons broken by obedience, and of a mother who mistook delusion for destiny. It is a reminder that evil need not roar to destroy. Sometimes it whispers in the language of love and God and family, until no one can tell the difference. And when that happens, even the holiest words can become a blade. The story of the Goins family might have remained a macabre footnote in Virginia's archives had it not been for a historian named Dr. Margaret Ellison. In the autumn of 1978, while cataloging a collection of early 20th century court documents in Wise County, she stumbled upon a sealed folder marked simply, Goins, E. et al., 1912. Inside were brittle pages, the full transcript of the trial, Sheriff Compton's field notes, and several letters written by Eliza from the asylum at Marion. The discovery would reignite public fascination with the case, not because it was newly shocking, but because of what it revealed about the human capacity for isolation, faith, and denial. Over the decades, the Goins name had become more myth than fact. Whispered by hunters, half remembered by old-timers, invoked by children around campfires, Ellison's research peeled back that myth, layer by layer, to expose the terrible reality beneath. The historian's obsession, Dr. Ellison, was no stranger to dark subjects. A professor at the University of Virginia, she specialized in Appalachian folklore and the anthropology of belief. But something about Eliza's writings struck her differently. They were not the ravings of a simple madwoman. They were structured, scriptural, and chillingly coherent. One line in particular haunted her: "The world will forget my name, but the land will not forget my voice." Ellison began traveling regularly to Wise County, interviewing descendants of those who had lived near the Goins homestead. Many refused to speak. Some claimed ignorance, others admitted that their parents and grandparents had deliberately kept silent, believing the story cursed. A few described strange experiences on the old ridge. The smell of smoke on windless nights, the feeling of being watched, the sound of distant singing where no path led. Ellison dismissed such tales at first, attributing them to the region's enduring folklore. But as she pieced together testimony and geography, she began to suspect that the Goins case represented something larger than isolated madness, a kind of collective blindness that had taken hold of an entire community. The return to the ridge in October of 1979, accompanied by a photographer and 2 local guides, Ellison made the difficult ascent to the Goins Ridge. The forest had reclaimed everything. The path, once a wagon road, was little more than a thread of soil between trees. After several hours, they reached a small clearing marked by a low rise of stones, all that remained of the cabin's foundation. The air was still, unnaturally so. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Among the stones, Ellison found remnants of metal, an iron hinge, fragments of a kettle, the rusted curve of what might have been a door latch. The photographer captured the sight in muted tones: gray rock against green moss, a single shaft of light filtering through the canopy. Later, when the photos were developed, Ellison would note a faint, almost imperceptible blur across one frame, a streak of white that seemed to drift between the trees. She mentioned it only once, in a private letter to a colleague, dismissing it as a trick of the lens. Still, she felt uneasy. That night, back in town, she recorded in her journal, "The ridge feels wrong, as though the earth remembers. I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in the persistence of tragedy." The letters from Marion, among the asylum records, Ellison found 7 surviving letters written by Eliza Goins between 1913 and 1919. They were addressed to no one, unsigned except for the initials E.G., and stored in a box labeled "Confiscated Writings." Religious content. The language was feverish yet deliberate, alternating between scripture and prophecy. She spoke of children unborn who will hear the call, of a bloodline buried but unbroken, and of the voice of the mother still whispering through the roots of the mountain. Most scholars dismissed the letters as the ramblings of a deteriorating mind, but to Ellison, they offered something else, a window into the psychology of isolation itself. The Goins family, she argued in her later writings, were less monsters than victims of a profound spiritual loneliness, a family cut off from the world until the boundaries between faith, blood, and survival collapsed entirely. The documentary in 1981, Ellison's research formed the basis of a PBS documentary titled The Ridge of Lost Souls, narrated in a grave, elegiac tone. It juxtaposed archival records with footage of the overgrown site. The film avoided sensationalism. It treated the Goins story not as horror, but as tragedy, a study in the perils of fanaticism and social neglect. Yet the documentary had an unintended effect. Tourism to Wise County increased sharply. Urban visitors came hoping to glimpse the haunted ridge. Teenagers camped in the woods, leaving behind graffiti and beer cans. Locals resented the intrusion. A small wooden sign erected by the county, site of the Goins cabin 1880-1912, was torn down within a year. Ellison herself withdrew from public appearances soon after the film aired. Friends said she felt the story had become distorted, transformed from cautionary tale into spectacle. They came to stare at ghosts, she wrote in a letter, when they should have been looking at themselves. The last investigation, in the spring of 1992, a survey crew working for a mining company uncovered a cluster of human bones near the base of the ridge. The remains were shallowly buried, fragile, and incomplete. The county coroner confirmed they were more than a century old. Though speculation immediately linked them to the Goins murders, no definitive identification could be made. The case was reopened briefly for documentation, then closed again. Dr. Ellison, by then retired, returned once more to the ridge. Now accompanied by her graduate assistant, standing among the pines, she remarked how quickly the land had healed. Time, she said, is the only thing that buries deeper than soil. That night, according to her assistant's account, she placed a small wooden cross near the excavation site and whispered a prayer. Not for the Goins family, but for the victims whose names had been forgotten. There's no forgiving, she said softly, but there can be remembering. Ellison died 3 years later. In her will, she requested that her papers be donated to the Virginia Historical Society with one condition, that the Goins letters never be published in full. Some words, she wrote, were meant to vanish with the voice that spoke them. The folklore today, half a century later, the Goins story persists in the local imagination, altered, exaggerated, but never entirely forgotten. Campers still speak of strange lights flickering through the trees. Hunters claim their dogs grow restless near the ridge. In some tellings, Eliza Goins is no longer a woman but a spirit of the hills, forever calling her lost sons home. Others say her voice can be heard in the wind before a storm, a low, wavering hum that chills the listener to the bone. But in the quiet corners of the Wise County Library, the true records remain, brittle, fading, yet stubbornly intact. Sheriff Compton's handwriting, neat and deliberate, the jury's signatures, the official seal pressed into yellowing paper. These artifacts outlast myth, anchoring the story in fact. And perhaps that is the final irony, the Goins tragedy, born from the belief that purity could transcend the human condition, has instead become a reflection of its frailty, a mirror held up to every generation that follows, warning of what happens when conviction outpaces compassion. Epilogue, The Voice Beneath the Soil. In the autumn of 2021, a hiker posted a video online claiming to have found the Goins chimney, deep in the Wise County woods. The footage showed a moss-covered stack of stones, half collapsed, with tree roots twisting through the base. The sound of the wind filled the recording, soft, steady, almost like breath. Viewers flooded the comments with speculation. Some heard whispers, others heard nothing but wind. Local historians verified the coordinates. It was, indeed, the site of the old homestead. No artifacts remained, only forest, silence, and the faint outline of human habitation long consumed by nature. In the end, that is perhaps where all such stories must return to the earth that bore them, indifferent and patient. The Goins family, the sheriff, the victims, even the historian who sought their truth, all have vanished, leaving behind a silence that hums faintly with memory. The ridge stands as it always has, steep, green, and shadowed. At dusk, the wind moves through the trees in a low, rhythmic cadence, almost like words too old to understand, and those who pass by swear that if they stop and listen closely, they can hear the echo of a woman's voice carried across the hollow. repeating the same phrase Sheriff Compton recorded in his final notes. The weeks following the trial's conclusion brought no sense of relief to Sheriff Compton. In theory, justice had been served, but in practice, the valley itself seemed disturbed, as though something unseen had been torn from the earth yet left a hollow behind. The newspapers had descended on Wise County like carrion birds, scribbling lurid accounts of the Goins abomination, each paper determined to outdo the next in moral outrage. Reporters quoted scripture, invoked curses, and speculated that madness, or worse, witchcraft, had infected the family. They left just as swiftly as they came, eager to chase newer horrors elsewhere, and the town was left to reckon with its own complicity in silence. For months, Compton avoided that stretch of ridge road, claiming the distance saved him time. The truth, though he would not admit it, was that the mere sight of the pines rising dark against the horizon unsettled him. Even when the case file was finally sealed and sent to the county archives, he found himself returning to it in memory. Certain sounds, fragments of Eliza's voice, would drift into his thoughts at night. Her calmness haunted him most of all. He had seen killers break down in weeping confession, and others curse him to his face, but never one who spoke of her crimes as sacred duty. It was the composure of conviction, not madness, that troubled him. By the following spring, the Goins property had begun to decay. Neighbors reported seeing wild dogs prowling the clearing, dragging bones from shallow graves the deputies had missed. Some claimed to hear a woman's voice carried on the wind, murmuring half-remembered verses. Compton dismissed such stories publicly, but ordered 2 deputies to ride out and burn the remaining structures. When they returned, pale and silent, one muttered that they had found symbols carved into the stones of the hearth. Crude circles, intersected by crosses, letters that might have been scripture or something older. They burned everything nonetheless. Even so, the sheriff could not escape the feeling that fire was a poor barrier against the kind of darkness that had taken root there. That summer brought an unusual heat. Crops withered on their stalks, wells ran low, tempers flared. The people of Wise County avoided speaking of the Goins case, but the silence itself seemed to fester. In the tavern, someone might whisper about that cursed ridge, and the room would fall still. When a young trapper went missing that July, the old fear returned. Search parties scoured the woods, terrified of finding what they half expected. They found nothing, and for once, that absence was enough. Compton grew older quickly after that year. The gray in his beard spread, and his hands, once steady, began to tremble when he wrote. He served 2 more terms as sheriff but declined to run again in 1916, citing his health. His successor was a younger man named Avery Cole, earnest, meticulous, and untested. Compton handed over the office, and with it, a trunk of unsolved cases. At the very top lay the Goins file. Cole had read about the trial as a boy, and the mere sight of the folder's worn edges made him uneasy. When he mentioned this to Compton, the old man gave a weary smile. "It's not the papers you need to fear," he said. "It's the silence between them." For years afterward, Compton lived quietly in a small house near the edge of town. He kept to himself, tending a modest garden and walking the wooded path that ran behind his property. Those who saw him said he still carried the same measured calm he had worn as sheriff. But there was a distance in his eyes, as though part of him still wandered the ridge. He died in 1918, his heart giving out in his sleep. Among his belongings was a journal filled with notes written long after the trial. Speculations, half-formed theories, dreams recorded as if they were evidence. On the final page, in a hand grown unsteady, he had written evil hides not in madness, but in belief. The journal might have been forgotten, if not for a historian named Ruth Welling, who arrived in Wise County in the early 1930s to catalog court records for the state archive. She found Compton's notebooks misfiled among routine correspondence and became fascinated by his meticulous accounts of local crimes. The Goins case, in particular, struck her as emblematic of the perils of rural isolation. She spent months interviewing descendants of the families who had lived near the ridge, gathering what little oral history remained. Most refused to speak, but a few elderly residents told her things that were never written in any report. That Eliza Goins had been known as a midwife before her husband's death, that travelers sometimes sought her for charms and cures, that she had read not only scripture but strange, leather-bound books in languages no one recognized. Welling's notes, now held in the state library, record a recurring phrase she heard from multiple informants. She called it the old blood. None could say precisely what that meant, though one man swore that his grandmother had spoken of a family mark, a birth defect passed down through the Goins line, an extra toe, or a small scar like ridge behind the ear. To Welling, it seemed like folklore, an attempt to rationalize horror through myth. Still, she wrote in her journal that the persistence of the tale, despite deliberate forgetting, suggests a deeper psychological scar upon the community, trauma inherited like a name. When Welling presented her research at the University of Virginia in 1935, she was criticized for romanticizing depravity. Her peers argued that madness and superstition were poor subjects for history. She defended her approach, insisting that the boundary between delusion and doctrine is often drawn only by power. Her paper was never published, and she moved on to other work, but the Goins file remained open on her desk until her death in 1949. Her nephew, settling her estate, donated the materials to the state archive, where they rested largely untouched for decades. It was not until 1974 that the case returned to public attention. A graduate student named Henry Adler, researching Appalachian folklore, stumbled upon Welling's papers and was struck by how contemporary they felt. The story of a family consumed by its own creed resonated with the emerging study of cult psychology. Adler visited Wise County that autumn and recorded interviews with locals who still remembered the name Goins spoken in warning tones. One man, a hunter in his 60s, claimed that his grandfather had found old iron nails driven into the trees around the burned clearing. A fence for the dead, he called it. Another woman said her mother would pour salt at the threshold each winter to keep the ridge from following us. Adler dismissed these as folk remnants, but noted how deeply fear had embedded itself in the landscape. When he finally hiked to the ridge himself, guided by a survey map from 1910, he found little more than moss, covered stones and a scattering of charred timbers. The forest had reclaimed everything. Yet as he wrote in his field notes, the air here feels thick, as if holding its breath. He left an offering of wildflowers, not from belief but from respect, and returned to Charlottesville uneasy. His paper, published in a small academic journal, argued that the Goins case represented a convergence of religious literalism, social isolation, and familial collapse. An American tragedy of belief unmoored from community. Today, the ridge is seldom visited. A narrow logging road passes within a mile of where the homestead once stood, but most locals still avoid it. Hunters say that the woods grow unnaturally quiet there, that even the birds seem reluctant to call. In autumn, when the fog hangs low, travelers on the old county road sometimes report seeing a flicker of light in the trees, as though from a lantern swinging slowly back and forth. They say that if you stop and listen, you might hear a woman's voice reciting scripture in a tone so calm, it makes your blood run cold. And so the story endures, not as a ghost tale, nor as a moral warning, but as something subtler and more insidious, a reminder that conviction, when cut off from reason and compassion, can twist into its own form of worship. The Goins name has faded from records, but the lesson lingers in every hollow and ridge where silence grows too deep. Evil, as Compton wrote, is not always madness. Sometimes it is simply certainty. The surviving records from the Wise County archives show a brief lull in official correspondence during the first months following the executions. The sheriff's ledger for late 1912 contains only routine entries, arrests for drunkenness, disputes over land, theft of livestock. Yet between those unremarkable notes lies a small sheet, undated and unsigned, describing disturbances on the ridge during moonless nights. It lists only the words, strange cries, infant woman, maybe animal, sound carried on wind. The handwriting is not Compton's, though likely belonged to one of his deputies. That document was later torn from the volume, leaving only the narrow impression of the ink pressed through the opposite page. The state hospital's correspondence offers its own uneasy continuity. Eliza Goins was listed as inmate number 4176. The matron's quarterly reports from 1913 to 1916 mention her only sparingly. Quiet disposition, reads constantly, often found at prayer, unwilling to eat for days, then sudden appetite. Several attendants noted that she insisted the doctors were heretics, that they had corrupted the words of Genesis through mistranslation. When presented with medical texts, she reportedly turned the pages backward, muttering in low tones, as though seeking hidden meaning in the reversal. By 1917 her handwriting had begun to deteriorate, though she continued to write letters addressed to no one, pages filled with looping scripture and personal amendments. One such letter, preserved in the state record due to its unusual content, is addressed to the true sons of Abraham, unblemished. It warns that the daughters of Eve must be kept within the family lest the blood of the serpent spread. The medical superintendent annotated the file with the phrase, "persistent religious delusion." No further commentary is offered, though a later memorandum in 1919 remarks upon a smell of oil and smoke in her cell. No source discovered. Her death in 1920 marked what officials presumed to be the end of the affair, but the hospital's undertaker, a man named F.N. Wills, made a notation that Eliza's body was claimed not by the state but by an unknown male, presenting family affidavit. The form lacks a signature. The burial register for Marion records a plot purchased that same week by someone under the name Caleb H. Goins. Though Caleb had been executed 8 years prior, the body's final resting place is unmarked. The ridge itself, long abandoned, continued to attract quiet curiosity. In 1923, a forestry survey noted the soil composition on the western slope as blackened, unusually rich, consistent with prior combustion. No mention is made of the burned foundation, yet among the same papers is an unsigned field note reading, "Structure site uneven. Faint outlines of cross burned into clay." Whether that mark was intentional or the random result of scorching has never been determined. When the cabin was burned in 1924, the event was never entered into any legal record. The Wise County Register printed only a brief item on March 12, "Unoccupied dwelling destroyed by fire near High Knob. No injuries reported." Local accounts, gathered decades later through oral interviews, suggest otherwise. One elderly resident recalled seeing a group of men walking from the woods that night carrying torches, their faces blackened with soot and silence. Another claimed she saw a woman among them, hair unbound, leading the procession as though conducting a rite. None could later identify her. By the 1930s, the case had passed into the realm of whispered caution, used by parents to keep children from wandering after dark. Stories of the ridge born circulated through the mining camp's pale figures who watched from the tree line, the sound of crying that stopped when approached. The Works Progress Administration's Folklore project of 1938 includes a brief transcript from an interview in Norton, Virginia, in which an unnamed woman recounts mother who married her own, and the forest that would not grow straight thereafter. The interviewer noted, possibly local embellishment of older story. Decades passed, yet the Goins name lingered in unexpected corners. A genealogist researching Appalachian settlement patterns in the 1960s discovered an unregistered grave in the Old Marion Cemetery, marked only with a hand-carved G and the year 1920. The surrounding graves were from families unrelated by name. When local officials were asked about it, they advised against further disturbance. The genealogist's field report ends abruptly, community reticent. Subject causes distress. The story might have faded entirely into folklore, had it not been for a graduate student at the University of Virginia, who in 1981 published a thesis titled Faith and Blood: Familial Theology in Isolated Rural Sects. Among the case studies is one referred to only as the Widow of the Ridge. The student traced the transmission of her writings through fragments preserved in church archives. He noted how Eliza's reinterpretation of Genesis mirrored certain heretical texts from the 18th century, specifically a pamphlet printed in Pennsylvania in 1789 advocating for purification of lineage. The student suggested that her beliefs were not spontaneous delusion, but part of a forgotten lineage of rural mysticism. That thesis was quietly withdrawn the following year. The departmental record lists incomplete documentation as the reason, but private correspondence between faculty members, later digitized, reveals a different concern. One professor wrote that the student had begun to believe his subject. He had been found copying Eliza's letters in longhand late at night, whispering scripture in the empty reading room. After his withdrawal, he disappeared from public record. A thin echo of the case surfaced again in 1997, when a regional television station produced a Halloween special on Virginia's hidden crimes. A local historian led the crew to the ridge, now part of the Jefferson National Forest. He described finding remnants of a foundation, though no stone larger than a fist remained in place. During filming, the audio recorded a faint high-pitched wail. Technicians attributed it to wind through hollowed saplings. Still, the segment's producer later refused to re-enter the forest. Even now, the Wise County Historical Society maintains a closed drawer labeled Goins Material, Restricted. Requests for access require written permission from the board, which has not been granted in over a decade. Those few who claim to have seen the contents speak of small glass jars labeled only with dates, and of a family Bible whose pages have been deliberately glued together. The last official document connected to the case appears in 2003, a request from a private medical researcher seeking permission to exhume remains for DNA analysis. The county denied the petition, citing lack of verified kinship. The request file, however, contains a photocopy of the researcher's letter, which ends with the phrase, "I have reason to believe the bloodline has not ended." No follow-up correspondence has been found. Today, the area remains sparsely inhabited. Locals avoid speaking the family name aloud, referring instead to the hollow or that ridge. Hunters sometimes report finding newborn animal carcasses arranged in patterns resembling human limbs. Park rangers dismiss these as the work of coyotes or pranksters, but the stories persist. An entry on an obscure genealogy forum posted in 2017 describes a visitor hiking near the site who found what he believed to be a child's ribcage protruding from eroded soil. Authorities were notified, the bones were collected, but forensic testing determined them to be pig remains. The hiker later deleted his account, though not before writing. The smell of smoke was everywhere, and someone kept whispering from the trees. Sounded like a woman saying pure blood, pure blood. No official acknowledgement of these reports exists, yet once in a while, a state archivist sorting old boxes will find a misfiled document, a note, a medical diagram, a piece of faded fabric, and, without understanding why, place it back where it was found. It is as if the case resists closure, as if the ridge itself insists on being remembered. What remains undeniable is that every generation since has rediscovered some trace of it. Whether through whispered folklore, forgotten thesis, or anonymous letter, the story refuses burial. It lingers in the gray margins between faith and madness, scripture and blood, where devotion curdles into heresy and family becomes its own grave. And when the evening wind moves through the pines above Wise County, locals say it carries with it the faint echo of a woman's voice, measured, calm, and sure, repeating a single phrase that no translation can redeem. In early 2006, an envelope without return address arrived at the Wise County Courthouse. Inside was a faded photograph, roughly 3 inches by 4, showing what appeared to be a woman standing in front of a weather-beaten cabin. The image was clouded by age, but her posture was unnervingly rigid, hands folded before her, eyes dark and unreflective even in daylight. On the back someone had written in a cramped, deliberate hand, "She kept them safe." The envelope contained no other paper. Clerk's handwriting on the file jacket reads simply, "Possible hoax." The photograph was placed in the restricted drawer beside the remaining Goins evidence. A few weeks later, a maintenance worker discovered that same drawer pulled slightly ajar one morning, though no record showed after hours entry. The locks were changed, and the incident passed without investigation. Still, small occurrences began to trouble the staff that spring, the smell of burned oil lingering in the record room, faint crying heard near closing time. One clerk described hearing what she thought was the voice of a child counting slowly from 1 to 7. When she turned, the corridor was empty. That same year, a doctoral candidate at Virginia Tech began compiling material for a dissertation on Appalachian folk religion. Her name was Dr. Mara Kincaid. Among the subjects she hoped to document was the Goins case. She wrote to the Historical Society requesting access to the restricted materials. Her first request was denied. The second, sent 6 months later with a formal university letterhead, was approved. For supervised examination only, she visited the archive in October 2006 and spent 3 days copying handwritten transcripts from Sheriff Compton's testimony, as well as the hospital's psychiatric evaluations of Eliza Goins. According to the visitor log, she departed the building each evening precisely at 5, polite and composed. Her notes, later recovered from her abandoned office, show a steady shift from analytical to personal tone. The first pages are cautious summaries of existing evidence. By the middle entries she begins writing in the first person. She believed the blood to be sacred, because she had no one left to love her except her own. Then, I think I understand her reasoning. It isn't faith, it's loneliness transfigured into law. The last entry in that notebook reads, "She wasn't insane, she was certain." The Dr. Kincaid returned to Wise County in March 2007, reportedly intending to visit the ridge itself. Weather records confirm that week brought unseasonable cold and heavy rain. Her rental car was found 2 days later on a gravel road off Route 759, doors unlocked, driver's seat soaked but engine dry. A pair of muddy footprints, bare, small, were visible leading from the passenger side toward the woods. No trace of her was ever located. The file remains open under the designation missing person, presumed deceased. In the wake of her disappearance, university officials quietly recalled the thesis proposal and sealed her research materials. Yet photocopies circulated privately among graduate circles. One such copy, examined years later, includes a curious marginal note written in Kincaid's hand beside a transcript of Eliza's confession. There were others before her. She learned from letters. Below that she penciled a partial address, Shawsville Parsonage 1834, and a small drawing of a 6-pointed flower. The parsonage in question still stands, though largely in ruin. County deeds confirm its existence during the 1830s as the residence of Reverend Thomas Riddick, a circuit preacher known for his eccentric sermons about the perfection of family flesh. His surviving notebooks, preserved in the Virginia Theological Library, contain passages nearly identical to Eliza Goins's later rhetoric. The same emphasis on purity of line, the same insistence that the serpent's corruption lies in mixture. It is now believed that some of his pamphlets circulated through the region well into the 19th century, distributed by traveling revivalists. How Eliza might have obtained one remains conjecture. By 2010, digital forums began rediscovering fragments of the legend. Amateur historians traded scans of yellowed newspaper clippings and hospital intake forms. Others claimed to have located descendants, though none produced verified genealogies. One anonymous user posted a series of photographs taken near the ridge, crude wooden effigies tied with twine, arranged in concentric circles. He described hearing whispering, like scripture read backward. His account was deleted within hours, yet the images spread quickly across smaller forums, often accompanied by the phrase, "She kept them safe." The line began appearing in stranger contexts, spray painted on bridge supports, etched into picnic tables near the high knob overlook. Some dismissed it as viral art. Others feared a revival of the old belief system. That autumn, a wildfire burned nearly 200 acres on the western slope, but firefighters reported finding no ignition source. One of them later told a reporter that the ground smelled of lamp oil. In 2012, an elderly woman arrived unannounced at the Wise County Library, carrying a small box wrapped in linen. She refused to give her name, saying only that she was off the blood. Inside the box were 3 brittle pages of Bible paper, covered in handwriting that forensic analysts later confirmed matched Eliza Goins's. The passages were copied from Genesis 19, but altered with interlinear notes describing holy unbinding. and returning seed unto the root. The woman vanished before authorities arrived. Surveillance cameras at the library's entrance captured only the lower half of her figure, a long black dress, bare feet pale against the concrete. Around that time, archivists began noticing that the Goins case file had grown heavier. Photocopies yellowed faster than expected, adhesive seals refused to stay shut, some documents appeared to reproduce themselves. 2 identical pages found in different folders, ink densities matching down to the blemish. No explanation was recorded. The archivist who kept the files resigned after hearing what she described as breathing from inside the cabinet. In 2014, a group of anthropology students conducted an unofficial nighttime visit to the ridge. Their footage, posted online, shows little until the final minutes. The camera pans across a clearing where 7 small mounds are visible, each marked with a cross made from deer antlers. A faint female voice repeats a phrase that none of the students recall hearing in person. Spectral analysis of the audio yields nothing but low-frequency wind. 2 of the participants later withdrew from the university, citing sleep paralysis and persistent crying in walls. The following year, a heavy rain uncovered what geologists thought to be remnants of the original smokehouse foundation. County authorities fenced the area, but trespassers soon stripped away stones as souvenirs. Those who kept them reported minor but unsettling events: milk soaring overnight, clock stopping precisely at 12:07 a.m., whispers through vents repeating verses from Genesis 6. The stones were eventually collected and stored in a maintenance shed behind the courthouse. 2 months later, the shed caught fire. Nothing else on the property burned. By 2016, the legend had entered modern folklore entirely detached from fact. Podcasts retold it as cautionary myth, and thrill seekers searched the forest for the lost altar. Yet beneath the exaggerations lay fragments of truth. The original case files, the execution records, the hospital reports, all verifiable. What remained inexplicable were the periodic reappearances of new material: photographs developed on antique plates, scraps of handwriting matching no living individual. The Wise County Board quietly reclassified the ridge as environmentally sensitive and closed public access. Still, the story continues to surface in the margins of ordinary life. Park employees hear a woman singing what sounds like a lullaby when fog settles thick over the hollow. Hunters find prints that start with human toes and end in claws. Travelers lose direction even with compasses steady. And sometimes, in late October, the county phone lines receive anonymous calls repeating the same phrase, calm and certain. She kept them safe. The caller never speaks again after that line. Those who study the case now divide it into 2 halves: the human crime of 1912 and whatever persists thereafter. The first can be explained by grief, delusion, isolation. The second refuses containment. Whether born of superstition or something older, the boundary between record and haunting grows thinner each decade. Scholars note that the written word itself seems to serve as conduit. Every transcription multiplies the presence, as though the act of remembering rewrites the world anew. The archives are silent tonight, but somewhere beyond the last locked drawer, paper rustles on its own. The smell of smoke returns, faint yet familiar, and if one listens closely enough, beneath the turning of the pages, a woman's voice whispers steady in the dark, pure blood, pure faith, pure flesh. The storm broke over the ridge just after nightfall, a relentless percussion of rain and wind that battered the trees and turned the dirt road into a river of mud. Inside the cabin, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop balanced on a crate, its glow the only light in the room. The walls seemed to breathe with the sound of the storm. She had been here for nearly 12 hours, combing through digitized microfilm and newspaper archives, the cursor blinking over a single, unfinished sentence in her notes. If the story of the Goins family was ever truly buried, then who dug it up? She had thought the final chapter of the legend had been written in 1920 with Eliza Goins's death. The records were clear. But now, scrolling through an obscure genealogical forum, she had found something that made her pulse quicken. A photograph posted in 2015 by a hobby historian in Marion. It showed a rusted key, a simple iron shape with a carved G on the bow. The caption read, "Found while renovating the basement of the old state hospital laundry building." Could this be related to the Goins case? She zoomed in on the image until the pixels blurred. The key looked handmade, the kind of thing a blacksmith might have forged decades before the Civil War. She cross-checked the hospital's inventory logs from 1912 and found no record of personal effects ever being transferred from Eliza's cell. If the key was hers, it should not have existed outside the facility. Thunder rolled across the mountains. Emily closed her laptop and listened. Beneath the storm, she could hear something else. The faint metallic clink of the wind, knocking an old chain against the porch rail. It was a sound she had been hearing all night, though now it seemed to echo with intention, a rhythm too steady to be random. She stood and moved to the window, her flashlight beam cutting through the sheets of rain. Nothing but trees and darkness. The floorboards creaked as she turned back toward her notes. She had printed the coroner's reports, the sheriff's statements, even a faded letter from a local minister who had written to the governor in 1913, pleading that the remains of the infants be buried on consecrated ground. In the margin of that letter, in handwriting that did not match the rest, someone had scrawled, "The mother still prays." Emily rubbed her arms, suddenly cold. The phrase had appeared in several versions of the story told around campfires and in online threads. The idea that Eliza Goins' spirit still whispered prayers in the ruins of her home. But those ruins had burned a century ago. She'd seen the satellite images. There was nothing left but forest. Still, the coincidence unsettled her. When the power flickered, she barely noticed. It wasn't until the laptop went black and the room fell silent, except for the rain, that she realized she was completely alone, miles from the nearest town, her phone signal long dead. She took a breath, steadying herself. She wasn't here to chase ghost stories, she was here to finish her book. The legend had endured for more than 100 years because people wanted it to. Fear gave it life. She lit a candle from her pack and sat down again. The light danced across the photographs pinned to the wall. Grainy images of the Goins homestead before the fire, the Wise County Jail, the gallows at Big Stone Gap. In one photo, taken in 1912, Eliza was standing between her two surviving sons, her hands clasped before her, her face turned slightly toward the camera. Her expression was calm, almost maternal. Emily had stared at that image so many times she could recite every detail, the loose strand of gray hair at her temple, the faint smudge on her left sleeve. But now, in the wavering candlelight, the photo seemed subtly changed. The woman's eyes, those dark, flat eyes, appeared to be looking directly at her. The wind screamed through the trees, rattling the shutters. The sound seemed to form words, low and indistinct, but rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. Emily shook her head and stood abruptly, pacing the cabin. She reminded herself that fatigue could do strange things to the mind. But then she heard it again, closer this time, as if someone were murmuring on the porch. She crossed the floor, heart hammering, and threw open the door. The storm had eased to a fine drizzle. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. The chain that hung from the porch beam swung idly in the wind, and there, on the top step, lay a small object half buried in the mud. She crouched and brushed away the dirt. It was a key, iron old, and carved with a crude G. Her breath caught. The photograph from the forum flashed in her mind, but this wasn't the same key. The design was slightly different, smaller, rougher. She turned it over in her palm. The metal was cold, but it felt almost warm at the edges, as if recently handled. She looked toward the tree line. The forest stretched in every direction, dark and endless. By the time morning came, Emily had convinced herself there was an explanation. Perhaps the key had fallen from her bag while unpacking. Perhaps it had been part of the old cabin's hardware, unearthed by the rain. She photographed it from every angle and packed her things. The ridge had a way of getting under your skin, she told herself. She needed distance. But even after she drove down the mountain, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something. Some clue buried in the records, that tied the past and present together. Back at the university archive, she ran a search through the hospital's death registries. Eliza Goins' entry was there, dated 1920. The cause of death, heart failure. But beneath that, in a faint pencil notation, someone had added a line, body transferred per family request. There were no surviving Goins relatives on record. The line shouldn't have been there. She traced the notation to a clerk named H.W. Latham, who had worked at the hospital until 1921 and later moved to North Carolina. He had donated his personal papers to a small county library in Asheville. 2 days later, Emily was there, requesting the collection. The papers were dull bureaucratic files, supply orders, letters, inventory lists. But at the bottom of one folder, she found a folded note on yellowed stationery. It read, "Shipment received. Box contained one body, adult female, dressed in black. Transfer witnessed by 2 men claiming kinship, surname given as Gowan, signature unreadable." The date was June 3, 1920, 3 days after Eliza's recorded death. Emily stared at the words until they blurred. If the note was genuine, then Eliza Goins's remains had not been buried at the hospital cemetery. 2 unidentified men had taken her body elsewhere. That night, in her hotel room, Emily spread the copies of the note and the old photographs across the bed. She traced the county maps, the location of the ridge, the burned homestead, the cemetery records. The timeline made no sense. Every source agreed the family line had ended in 1912 with the executions, unless, she hesitated, remembering a brief mention in one of Sheriff Compton's reports. A cousin, who had lived across the Tennessee line, a man questioned early in the investigation, but released for lack of evidence. His name had been Silas Gowan. She looked up the property records for that name. The last entry was from 1932, deed transfer, land value negligible, property description matching a small farm 30 miles from the original ridge. A private cemetery was marked on the edge of the parcel. 2 days later, Emily was standing at the edge of that property, overgrown and silent. The farmhouse had long collapsed into its foundation. Vines tangled the fence posts. She followed the outline of an old stone wall until she found it a small clearing, half hidden by trees. A wrought iron gate leaned on one hinge, and beyond it, a handful of markers protruded from the earth. Most of the stones were blank, weathered smooth by time, but one slightly larger than the rest still bore legible letters, e.g. 1849-1920. Below it, faintly carved, "The blood endures." Emily knelt, her pulse quickening. She reached for her camera, but before she could focus, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. Like a branch breaking underfoot. She froze. Another sound followed, closer, the soft drag of fabric against wet grass. She turned toward the noise, but the forest was empty. The air had gone utterly still. Then a whisper, barely audible. "The mother still prays." The candle she had left on the stone flickered and went out. Emily didn't remember running. Only the sound of her breath tearing through her chest, and the hammer of her boots on the mud. The forest closed in around her, branches whipping her face, rain-soaked leaves clinging to her clothes. When she finally stumbled back onto the road, she collapsed beside her car, trembling and gasping. The woods behind her were silent, too silent, as though the storm itself had paused to listen. She drove without thinking, headlights cutting tunnels through the mist, the wipers screeching against the windshield. The words kept looping in her mind. "The mother still prays." She had heard them. She knew she had. A trick of the wind, perhaps. Echoes from her own exhausted imagination. But the voice had been close, almost inside her ear, and it had not sounded like her own. It was nearly dawn when she pulled into the motel lot back in town. The world was pale and washed clean by rain. She sat for a long time before unlocking her phone, searching for reception. A single bar flickered to life. She typed a message to her colleague David, back at the university. "Found something. Possible grave. Need to verify records. Gowan property 1932 deed transfer. Also, maybe send someone to check hospital archives again. Something's wrong with the death file." She hit send and stared at the screen until the message showed as delivered. Then she locked the doors, drew the curtains, and slept for 14 hours. When she woke, the sun was low. Her phone buzzed with 3 missed calls and a single voicemail from David. His voice was tight. "Emily, where the hell have you been? I checked the hospital files. You're right. The death certificate was altered. There's a note attached to the physical copy, not in the digital scans. It says, "Return to origin." Also, I can't find the Latham correspondence you mentioned. That note about the body transfer. It's missing from the folder. Call me. She sat up, pulse racing. Return to origin. What did that mean? The phrase carried the same biblical cadence as Eliza's own language. She remembered the old woman's reported last words from the court transcript. All flesh must return to its source. Emily replayed the voicemail 3 times, each time hearing something new in David's tone. Concern, yes, but also fear. He had sounded afraid for her. She opened her notebook and began writing everything she could remember about the night in the woods, forcing herself to focus on detail, the shape of the stone, the lettering on the grave, the whisper. She needed evidence, not impressions. By morning, she was back on the road. She told herself she was only returning to photograph the grave in daylight, to collect verifiable proof. But beneath that rational plan pulsed something darker, a need to see it again, to be certain it existed. The ridge seemed almost welcoming now, the fog lifting in pale ribbons as she climbed higher. When she reached the clearing, the sun had burned through the morning mist. The gate stood exactly as before, the iron twisted and brittle with age. She stepped through carefully, camera in hand. The headstones were still there, but the one marked E.G. was gone. She dropped to her knees, scraping at the soil. The earth was disturbed, freshly turned. Someone had been here since the night before. A shallow impression marked where the stone had stood, and beside it, something glinted in the dirt. She brushed it clean, a fragment of metal, curved like part of a lock's mechanism. She slipped it into her pocket and took photos of the site from every angle. Then she noticed the smell. Earthy at first, then sharper, sweet and foul, like decaying flowers. It was coming from the far corner of the clearing, where a fallen tree had split open the ground. Inside the hollow was something wrapped in oilcloth. Her stomach turned, but she couldn't stop herself. She pulled the fabric back. The bundle was small, no larger than a shoebox. Inside lay a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked, its dress yellowed with age. Around its neck hung a ribbon, and tied to the ribbon was a small iron key. The world tilted. The key was identical to the one she had found on the cabin porch. Her hands trembled as she untied it. The doll's glass eyes stared up at her, blank and unblinking. On its chest, written in faded ink, were 3 letters E.G. A twig snapped behind her. Emily spun around, heart pounding. A man stood just beyond the trees. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by shadow. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he spoke, his voice low and even. "You shouldn't be here." Emily swallowed. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer. His face was lean, his features sharp, his eyes pale gray. "My name's Nathaniel Gowan," he said. "This land belongs to my family." Her mind reeled. "Your family? The Goins family?" He smiled faintly. "That name doesn't exist anymore. We changed it. A long time ago." She took a cautious step back. "You're related to Eliza Goins." His expression didn't change. "I'm her blood. The last of it." She didn't speak. The air seemed to thicken around them. Nathaniel tilted his head. "You've been asking questions. Digging where you shouldn't. My great-grandmother's story was finished 100 years ago. It doesn't need rewriting." "I'm not rewriting," Emily said. "I'm trying to understand." "There's nothing to understand," he said softly. She was right. A chill swept through her. Right about what? About purity. About what the world forgot. She kept the line clean. The Emily took another step back, but the man's tone didn't change. It stayed calm, almost reverent. She knew what had to be done. He continued. "And those who came after remembered. That's why we took her back. Why she rests here, where she belongs." Emily's hand closed around the camera. "You moved her body." Nathaniel's eyes glimmered. The "we" returned it to its origin. The forest was silent except for the wind whispering through the leaves. Emily felt the hair on her arms rise. "You don't understand what you're saying," she whispered. "Oh, I do," he said, and smiled. A slow, unsettling curve of his mouth. "The blood endures." She turned and ran. Branches tore at her clothes, the camera strap slapping against her chest. Behind her, she thought she heard footsteps, but she didn't look back. When she reached the car, she fumbled with the keys, slammed the door, and gunned the engine. She didn't stop until she hit the main highway. The entire drive back to town, she kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting headlights to appear. None did. That night she uploaded the photos to her laptop. Every image was sharp except one. The picture of the grave. The spot where the headstone should have been was blurred, the soil smeared in a haze of motion, as if the camera had captured movement she hadn't seen. She zoomed in. The blur resolved into the faint outline of a hand pressed into the dirt. She closed the laptop, shaking. She couldn't go to the police. She had no proof of anything except her own fear. Instead, she opened a new document and began to write. She wrote until her fingers ached, until the words became a shield against what she had seen. By dawn, she had reached her conclusion. The Goins case wasn't just a story of madness and isolation. It was a story that had never ended, a lineage that had survived quietly in the shadows, still believing in the twisted creed Eliza had preached. She titled the draft, "The Blood Endures." When she sent it to David, she included a short note. "If something happens to me, tell them to search the ridge. There's more there than bones." 2 days later, David tried to reach her. She didn't answer. Her motel room was empty, her car still parked outside, her belongings neatly packed. On the desk sat her laptop, still open. The last line she had written glowed faintly on the screen. "The mother still prays." The rain had not stopped for 3 days, when David finally reached the ridge. The old road had turned to mud, and each mile seemed to fight against him. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and pine resin, and the world beyond the windshield blurred into gray. He hadn't told anyone exactly where he was going. He'd left a message with his editor saying only that he was following up on the Goins material, and that he'd be out of cell service for a few days. In truth, he wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe that was what he wanted. The last house he passed before the road narrowed to a single track belonged to a farmer named Raymond Kessler. The man was in his 70s, lean as wire, wearing a canvas coat darkened by rain. He waved David down, as if expecting him. When David rolled down his window, the old man peered in, his eyes the pale blue of weathered glass. "You headed up toward the old ridge?" he asked. David nodded. "Trying to find the old Goins place. You know it?" Kessler's mouth tightened. "Everybody around here knows it. Not many go there, though. You planning on staying long?" "Just looking," David said. "Doing some research." Kessler looked past him, toward the mist curling through the trees. "You'll find what you came for, maybe. But you won't like it." He stepped back, letting David pass. As the car pulled away, the farmer lifted his hand again. Not a wave this time, but something closer to a warning. The trail to the ridge was nearly gone, swallowed by undergrowth. David parked when the tires began to spin and continued on foot. His boots sank into the muck, and every sound seemed too loud. The crack of twigs, the whisper of rain through dead leaves. The deeper he went, the more it felt like the forest was closing in, not maliciously, but with the slow, inevitable pressure of time itself. After half an hour, he saw the clearing. It wasn't much, just a small depression where the trees thinned, and the ground leveled into a patch of grass and broken stone. The foundation of the Goins cabin was still visible, a rectangle of moss-covered rock. A few feet away, the outline of the old smokehouse sagged in on itself, timbers blackened and half-buried. The forest had claimed it all. Only the silence remained. He stood there for a long time, trying to imagine the place as it had been described in court transcripts and newspaper accounts. The stories had always felt like fiction to him, until now. There was something heavy in the air, a stillness that made his chest tighten. He took out his camera, snapped a few pictures, then crouched beside the foundation, brushing away a layer of leaves. Beneath them was a patch of charred earth, flecked with fragments of iron and glass, the remnants of the fire that had supposedly cleansed the place a century ago. He turned on his recorder. June 5, 2023. he said softly. Goins property site, structure long gone. Evidence of burn remains visible. Atmosphere oppressive. Wind almost completely still. Feels like the kind of quiet that follows after sound, rather than before it. He stopped the recording. The words sounded hollow, like something from a lecture. He felt foolish even saying them aloud. And yet, when the wind did come, minutes later, it carried with it the faintest echo of something he couldn't place. Not quite voices, not quite the wind's own cry, but something layered between them. He froze, then it was gone. By late afternoon, he'd made camp near the old well, where a few stones still stood upright. He built a small fire and set his recorder nearby, letting it run. He flipped through Emily's notebook, the pages damp and warped from rain. Her last entry was dated May 14, 2021. Heard them again last night. A woman's voice, not far off, sounded like she was praying. I thought at first it was my imagination, but the dogs heard it too. They started howling. The line ended there, mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted. David looked up from the notebook to the darkening trees. He didn't have dogs. He had nothing but the crackling fire and the whispering rain. Somewhere out there, the ridge dropped away into miles of untouched forest. He thought of Emily, of how her flashlight might have flickered out in this same place, of how close she'd been to the end without knowing it. He wondered if she'd come here chasing truth or running from it. As the night deepened, fog began to roll in, the fire shrank to embers. David lay awake, staring up at the blurred canopy. His recorder clicked softly beside him as it continued to spin. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, the recorder had stopped, and the forest was silent again. Too silent. He sat up. The mist was thicker now, so dense it turned the trees into silhouettes. And then he heard it, a woman's voice, faint, distant, not singing, not crying, speaking. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm was unmistakable, a kind of low, deliberate chant. He turned toward the sound, fumbling for his flashlight. It cut through the fog for only a few feet before fading into white. The voice stopped. He held his breath waiting. Nothing. He told himself it was just the wind funneling through the hollows, or a trick of sound bouncing off the valley walls. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. The voice had come from language, from meaning. He sat there until dawn, when the fog finally lifted and the world returned to gray daylight. When he played back the recording the next morning, the sound was faint but undeniable. At the 47-minute mark, just beneath the hiss of static, a voice murmured something like a prayer. He replayed it over and over, straining to catch the words. It was the cadence that chilled him most, measured, calm, almost maternal, like a sermon spoken to a congregation of one. He packed up his gear and left the ridge by noon. The forest seemed less oppressive in the daylight, but the sense of being watched never left him. Back in town, he stopped at the public library to upload his recordings and transcribe his notes. When the librarian, an older woman with silver hair and thick glasses, asked what he'd been researching, he hesitated before answering. Local history, he said. The Goins family. She looked up sharply. You didn't go up there, did you? He nodded. Yesterday. She sighed and shook her head. Every few years someone does. Reporters, students, ghost hunters. They always come back saying they heard something. Some of them don't come back at all. David closed his laptop. What do you mean? There's a pattern, she said quietly. Since the 1950s at least, people go missing in those woods. Not many, but enough. Hunters, hikers. The old folks say the ridge takes what it's owed. But he thought she was joking, but her face was perfectly serious. She went back to stamping books without another word. That night in the motel room, he listened to the recording again. He had cleaned up the audio, filtering the static until the voice became clearer. It was definitely a woman. The accent was old, the vowels drawn out, the consonants clipped in a way no one spoke anymore. Blessed are the pure, for they shall see. The rest was lost in distortion. He stared at the waveform on his laptop, his reflection flickering in the dark screen. He knew what he should do: send the files to his editor, write up the article, move on. But the longer he listened, the more he felt as if the voice wasn't just on the recording anymore. It was behind him. In the room, waiting, he turned off the player and sat in silence. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the motel heater and the sound of his own breathing. Then, from somewhere deep in the walls came a faint, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles brushing against wood. 3 slow knocks. He didn't move. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, the sound was gone, but his notebook was open on the desk. A single line had been written in the margin, in handwriting that wasn't his. "You found what you came for." David left town an hour later. He never published his article. The audio file was found years afterward, mislabeled on a university server, the voice degraded almost to nothing but static. Yet those who've listened claim that if you turn the volume high enough, you can still hear a woman whispering through the noise. Her words indistinct, but her tone unmistakable, patient, maternal, and utterly certain that her work was not yet finished.